Unknown planets, legendary battles, and incredible stories await you here. But don't forget to be a part of this universe. Subscribe, like, comment, be a part of this great adventure. The ultimatum arrived with the precision of a guillotine, cold, absolute, and inescapable. Humanity had overstepped its bounds, and the Galactic Council had spoken. We were to cease our expansion immediately, abandon the outer colonies, and retreat to the fragile cradle of our homeworld. If we refused, the consequence was extinction. The message did not come as a mere diplomatic warning, nor was it a negotiation. It was a decree, transmitted through every known channel, echoed in the control rooms of planetary governors, defense outposts, and the great halls of Earth's leadership. Even civilians, sitting in the quiet of their homes, found their screens hijacked by the Council's message. The proclamation delivered in hundreds of languages with chilling uniformity. There was no offer of peace, no illusions of compromise. The message was simple: submit or perish. But Earth did not tremble. Humanity had long since exhausted its fear, spent across centuries of uncertainty. The first time we ventured beyond the safety of our world, we were met not with wonder, but with cold indifference. The stars were not empty, they were owned. The galactic stage was ancient, its players unfathomably powerful. We were not pioneers, we were trespassers, tolerated only because we were insignificant. For decades, the Council had watched our ascent with detached amusement, content to let us struggle like children building castles in the sand. We were primitive to them, our ships frail, our ambitions laughable. They assumed we would learn our place. They assumed we would obey. But they had made one fatal miscalculation. They had given us time. Time to study them. Time to understand the limits of their technology. Time to create something they could not counter. Beyond Neptune's orbit, hidden beneath the frozen wastelands of Pluto, a planet long abandoned, dismissed as a graveyard of ice, the planet killer waited. It was a weapon unlike any conceived before. Not a bomb, nor a fleet, nor even a superweapon in the traditional sense. It did not rely on kinetic force or nuclear devastation. It did not burn, shatter, or incinerate. It unmade. Its very existence had been buried under layers of secrecy so deep that even those who had built it knew only fragments of the truth. There were no tests, no prototypes. It had been designed with a singular, horrifying certainty. If it was ever used, there would be no second attempt. And now, as the Council's fleet carved its way through the void, it was time to unveil what we had become. The Galactic Council's armada was the most formidable military force in known space. Hundreds of vessels, each the product of 1,000 conquered civilizations, moved in flawless formation. Their ships were vast and angular, dark hulls lined with the scars of previous wars. These were not vessels of exploration or diplomacy. They were executioners, honed over millennia of conquest. To them, this was not a battle. It was a culling. Inside Earth's orbital command, silence stretched like a taut wire. The station, one of the last defensive bastions above the planet, was filled with officers watching the incoming fleet. Their holographic displays pulsed with red markers, each one a harbinger of destruction. At the helm stood Admiral Elise Morrow, her gaze steady, her expression unreadable. Her hands remained clasped behind her back, knuckles white against the pressure of what was to come. Every possible outcome had been calculated. None favored Earth. No fleet, no strategy, no conventional defense could withstand what approached. But humanity did not need victory. We only needed survival. A soft chime rang through the chamber, signaling an incoming transmission. The central display flickered, and a figure materialized. The Council's emissary was tall, robed in black ceremonial silks. His elongated features were sculpted in disdain, his skin smooth and pale, his eyes voids, bottomless and unreadable. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of an empire. "Your time is up." The words were deliberate, hollow, as if spoken from a place beyond emotion. "Submit." Morrow did not blink. Her officers did not breathe. Her voice, when it came, was steady, unshaken, final. No. For the first time in recorded history, the Galactic Council hesitated. It was barely a moment, a flicker of uncertainty that passed like a shadow across the emissary's face. But it was there. Morrow turned to her weapons officer, a man who had spent the last 3 years monitoring a button he had prayed never to press. She gave the order without ceremony. Fire! There was no flash. No roar of destruction. Space did not allow for theatrics. One moment, the lead ship of the Council's fleet was whole. The next it was gone. Not shattered. Not burned. Erased. Every atom that had once composed it simply ceased to exist, unraveling in an instant. There was no explosion, no debris, only a faint, glowing mist where an unstoppable dreadnought had once loomed. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, chaos. Council ships veered erratically, commanders scrambling to comprehend the impossible. Their shields had not flickered. Their armor had not melted. The countless layers of defense they had perfected across centuries of warfare had done nothing. Another shot fired. A second ship disappeared, this time a flag carrier, the nerve center of their command structure. The formation collapsed. Some ships held their ground, their weapons priming to fire. Others turned and ran, the first ever to flee from a human enemy. The Galactic Council, the most dominant force in the known universe, had never feared humanity before. Now they did. Morrow watched it unfold without triumph, without arrogance. There was no celebration in the chamber. No cheers. This was not victory. It was only the beginning. The silence after the first shot had been deafening. It had stretched across the command center like a held breath, a moment too vast to measure in seconds. But silence never lasted in war. The Council's fleet had fractured, its once imposing formation now a chaos of retreating vessels and aimless movements. They had come to exterminate us. Instead, they had learned fear. But fear alone would not end this war. Admiral Elise Morrow stood motionless as the tactical display updated in real time, the red indicators of the enemy ships blinking erratically. Some drifted, as if their captains were frozen in indecision. Others had already begun their withdrawal, their engines flaring against the backdrop of deep space. She could feel the weight of the room behind her, officers, technicians, analysts, each of them waiting, listening. Not for orders. Not anymore. They were waiting for confirmation that what they had just witnessed was real. That the greatest fleet in the known universe had crumbled in an instant. Status. Her voice, though level, cut through the tension like a scalpel. Lieutenant Harrow, a man whose steady hands now clenched white-knuckled at his console, cleared his throat. Confirmed destruction of primary and secondary targets. No residual matter. No energy signatures. Just gone. His voice faltered on the last word. Morrow exhaled. Slow and deliberate. Even those who had known about the weapon hadn't truly understood it. The planet killer was not conventional. It did not rip ships apart or leave wreckage smoldering in the void. It erased them at a fundamental level. No debris. No bodies. No evidence that anything had ever existed in those coordinates. The Council had believed their technology was absolute. That there was no force they could not counter. No enemy they could not dominate. Now they had been proven wrong. The question was, would they accept it? Morrow turned to her comms officer. Open a channel. The room tensed. A warning shot was one thing. Speaking to the enemy was another. The officer hesitated, then nodded. The signal pulsed across the void, seeking the fleet's command ship, the harrowing Dawn, a dreadnought that had not yet moved. It sat still in space, its shields humming with potential energy, as if weighing its next move. A moment later, the screen flickered to life. The same emissary appeared, but something had changed. Gone was the quiet arrogance, the unreadable expression of a superior addressing the doomed. His features were taut now, his gaze sharp with something that looked suspiciously like calculation. Admiral Morrow did not give him time to speak. You came here to deliver an ultimatum, she said, her voice measured, almost conversational. Now, I'm delivering one of my own. The emissary's lips pressed into a thin line. He said nothing, but the subtle tightening of his jaw was enough. He was listening. You will leave this system. You will recall all forces from human territory. And you will not return. Morrow leaned forward slightly, letting the weight of her words settle. Because next time, we won't stop at your fleet. A beat of silence. Then, you believe you have won, the emissary said, his voice quiet but edged with something dangerous. That this, Weapon changes everything. Morrow tilted her head. Hasn't it?
For the first time, a shadow of a smirk touched the alien's face. Something not quite amusement, not quite anger.
Something else. You misunderstand the Council, Admiral. His gaze darkened. We are not simply a fleet. Not a singular force.
We are a civilization that has stood for millennia, bound together by a power you do not yet comprehend.
He leaned in, mirroring her posture. You believe you have shattered us. A pause. But you have only drawn our attention. A cold weight settled in Morrow's chest, though she did not let it show. This had never been just a battle. This had been a test. And they had passed.
She severed the transmission without another word. The moment the screen darkened, the tension in the room collapsed into a flurry of motion. Officers turned to their stations, voices rising as reports came in.
The enemy fleet was withdrawing. The immediate threat was over. But Morrow remained still. She had spent years preparing for the Council's attack, knowing that if humanity lost, there would be no second chance. Every calculation had been made, every strategy weighed. But now, for the first time, she faced something uncertain. They had expected submission. We had given them annihilation. And in doing so, we had forced them to truly see us. For the first time, the Council was not reacting to a lesser species. They were reacting to an equal. Or perhaps to something even worse. A threat.
Morrow turned to her officers, to the men and women who had just helped reshape the future of the galaxy.
Her expression was unreadable, but her words were clear. We prepare for war. War does not end with the last shot. It lingers, reshaping itself, waiting in the spaces between battles. Admiral Elise Morrow stood in Fort Aegis, the nerve center of Earth's military might, watching the Atlantic stretch into the horizon. The golden shimmer of dawn kissed the waves, painting a false portrait of peace. Yet beneath the surface, of the ocean, of the world, something had shifted. The Galactic Council had retreated, but its silence was not surrender. It was a silence that watched, that waited. The absence of an immediate counterattack was unnatural. If history had taught anything, it was that empires did not yield without a reckoning. Behind her, the command center hummed with quiet urgency. Large monitors projected fleet movements across human-controlled space. Analysts parsed encrypted data streams, engineers synchronized planetary defenses, and intelligence officers exchanged murmured updates. Yet despite the relentless flow of information, one thing remained achingly clear. The Council was gone. Not just in movement, but in communication, in presence. Where there should have been intercepted orders or mobilization reports, there was nothing. No transmissions. No probes. No diplomatic feelers reaching out for negotiations. A growing black void had begun to spread across the holographic star map, an area near the Council's core worlds where all signals had ceased. It was more than a lack of response. It was as if something had erased their presence entirely. Commander Hale exhaled sharply, his arms crossed as he studied the map. I don't like this. Morrow didn't look at him. Neither do I. This isn't just regrouping, he muttered. If they were planning a counterstrike, we'd see something. Fleet movements, reallocated forces, supply routes. But this? They just stopped. Morrow turned from the window and stepped toward the main console, the galactic display illuminating the sharp lines of her face. Her voice remained level, but an edge had crept into it. Predators don't announce when they're about to strike. They wait for their prey to relax. Hale shifted his stance. What if we're not the prey? Morrow met his gaze. The thought had already settled uncomfortably in her mind. What if their silence wasn't directed at us? A sharp chime cut through the low murmurs of the command center. Admiral! The comms officer turned from her console, her brow furrowed. Incoming transmission. Unverified origin. Morrow arched an eyebrow. Blocked signatures, but it's using a pre-war encryption, the officer continued, fingers moving rapidly over the console. Old Earth military frequencies. Morrow's spine stiffened. That was impossible. Open it. The screen flickered, static warping the image for a fraction of a second before it resolved into a face Morrow had never expected to see again. General Soren. Her voice, usually unshaken, carried an unspoken weight. The man on the screen had been declared dead 2 years ago.
Lost in deep space during a classified reconnaissance mission near Council borders, his ship had disappeared without a trace. His death had been recorded, his name carved into the halls of the fallen. Yet here he was. Leaner, older, eyes hollowed by something more than time. "Hello, Admiral," Soren said, his voice steady. But there was something beneath it. A tension. A pressure barely held in check. Hale stiffened beside her. "You're supposed to be dead." Soren let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "I was." He paused, his expression darkening. "And I might be again soon if you don't listen carefully." Morrow didn't move. "Go on." Soren exhaled, his breath flickering through the transmission as if the signal itself strained against interference. "They're not regrouping for a counterstrike, Elise." His tone was clipped, urgent. "They're preparing for something worse." The room went still. Morrow's pulse remained steady, but her mind sharpened. She had been right. This wasn't about retaliation. It was about containment. "Explain." Soren leaned forward, the dim light casting deep shadows across his face. "The Council has never been what we thought it was. It's not just a government or a military power. It's a prison." A ripple of unease passed through the room. Morrow's expression remained neutral, but inside, calculations ran at blinding speed. "A prison," she repeated. "For what?" Soren's jaw tensed. "A power older than any of us. Older than the Council itself." He hesitated, then said, "And when you fired the planet killer, when you erased those ships, you broke part of that prison." No one spoke. Morrow became aware of the sound of her own breathing, the quiet crackle of the transmission, the way the light from the star map flickered across the walls, as if the universe itself was struggling to process what had been said. "You're saying we didn't just destroy their fleet," she said slowly. "We released something." Soren nodded once. "And the Council's not preparing to attack us," he said. "They're preparing to stop what's coming." A soft static hum pulsed through the connection. Morrow could hear the low flickers of a failing signal, the strain of encrypted frequencies pushing against interference that shouldn't be there. Soren grimaced, adjusting something off-screen. "I don't have time to explain everything," he said. "I'm sending you coordinates. Meet me there. I need to show you what I've seen." Hale took a sharp step forward. This could be a trap. Morrow didn't answer immediately. She studied Soren's face, the angle sharper, the eyes hollowed by something deeper than exhaustion. Fear. Not the fear of an ambush. Not the fear of death. The fear of a truth he had seen with his own eyes. Morrow's decision was made before she even realized it. "We'll be there." Soren exhaled, tension flickering through his expression. Relief. Or resignation. Then you might have a chance to survive what's coming. The transmission cut out. The hum of the command center remained, the quiet murmur of data streams and shifting reports. Yet it felt different now. Like the air had changed. Like the universe itself had just leaned in to listen. Hale turned to her, arms crossed. "You really think this is worth the risk?" Morrow looked back at the galactic map. The dead zone had spread even further, swallowing entire sectors. And in its center, something new flickered, something unreadable. Not a signal. Not an absence. Something else. She took a breath. "If it's not," she said, "then we're already dead." The Dreadnought-class warship, Eidolon, slipped from Earth's orbit like a ghost, its hull a seamless blend of matte black alloys designed to drink in the light. It was built for stealth, for silent movement through the void, yet now it carried the weight of something far heavier than war, uncertainty. Admiral Elise Morrow stood on the bridge, arms clasped behind her back, her gaze locked on the star-streaked abyss ahead. The ship's interior hummed with quiet tension, its crew efficient, disciplined, but undeniably uneasy. They weren't launching an offensive. They weren't preparing for battle. They were heading into the unknown. Soren's coordinates pointed to an uncharted system at the edge of the Council's dead zone, a place that had, until now, held no strategic importance, no recorded anomalies. Yet, in the wake of the planet killer's detonation, the sector had transformed into a growing void, swallowing communications, obscuring scans. Something was there, and they were going to find out what. Commander Hale stood beside her, eyes flicking between readouts. We'll reach the rendezvous point in 2 hours.
Still no signals from the council, no sign of Soren's ship. He'll be there, Morrow said. Hale exhaled through his nose. I hope so.
He didn't voice what they were both thinking. If Soren wasn't there, it wasn't just a missed meeting.
It meant he had been silenced. The deck vibrated subtly beneath their feet as Eidolon dropped from superlight travel. The system loomed before them, its sun a dull ember casting long shadows over an expanse of derelict celestial bodies. A field of shattered moons and drifting planetary debris told a story of destruction long forgotten, or erased. This system isn't in any of our records, Hale muttered, scanning the data. No planets, no settlements. Why here?
Morrow didn't answer immediately.
The sensors were still processing the void ahead, struggling to make sense of something that shouldn't be possible. No energy readings. No gravitational anomalies. Just absence. Then, a single blip. A ship. Soren's. Bring him in, Morrow ordered. Within minutes, a secondary vessel detached from the darkness and approached, its worn exterior battle-scarred, its signal flickering as if reality itself struggled to keep hold of it. The docking bay hissed as the ship connected. Seconds later, the airlock cycled open, and General Soren stepped onto the deck. He looked worse than before. Hollowed out. His uniform, once crisp, was frayed at the edges, stained with something darker than simple wear. His eyes, sharp but distant, locked onto Morrow's. You made it, he said, voice rough.
We don't abandon our own, she replied. Something flickered in his gaze. Relief, maybe, but buried under exhaustion.
Then let's not waste time. Morrow led him toward the war room, where a holographic projection of the system flickered above the main table. The dead zone pulsated at its center. What the hell is out there, Soren? Hale demanded. And don't give me more riddles. We're past that. Soren ran a hand through his unkempt hair. He looked at the projection, then back at them. You don't understand what the council really is. Morrow crossed her arms. Enlighten us. Soren exhaled. It was never about politics. Never about controlling lesser civilizations.
That was all secondary. He pointed at the void.
The council exists because of that. The room was deathly still. Hale frowned. Explain. Soren's voice dropped lower, as if saying it aloud might make it more real. A long time ago, long before humans, before the council's oldest species, something came. It wasn't an invasion. It wasn't war. It was worse. He turned to the projection, adjusting the controls. The display zoomed in, peeling back layers of the void, revealing something beneath it. Not a ship. Not a station. Something massive. Morrow's breath stilled. It wasn't just a structure. It was a tomb. A lattice of unnatural geometry, sprawling across space like a wound in reality itself. It pulsed with an almost organic rhythm, its surface shifting between solidity and something else. Soren continued. The council didn't build itself. It was formed out of desperation, to contain this. The weight of it settled over them.
Morrow studied the impossible structure, unease coiling deep in her gut.
What is it? Soren's throat worked as he swallowed. A prison. A barrier. A final act of survival against something that should not exist. The room had never felt colder.
Morrow kept her voice even.
And when we used the planet killer? Soren nodded. You shattered part of it. A silence stretched between them, heavy with realization. The planet killer had been humanity's greatest weapon, its triumph over the council's tyranny. But in unleashing it, they hadn't just destroyed an enemy fleet. They had broken something ancient. Hale ran a hand down his face. You're saying we just freed a, what? A god. A force of nature. Soren shook his head. I don't know what it is. No one does. Because no one has ever survived seeing it. The hologram flickered. A new signal emerged from within the void, not a distress beacon, not a fleet movement. Something else had just woken up. Morrow inhaled slowly, keeping her hands steady at her sides. Then we find out what we're dealing with. Soren's expression darkened. You don't find it. It finds you. And outside, in the depths of space, the void shifted. The void was not empty.
It was not space, not a vacuum, not the absence of matter. It was something else. Admiral Elise Morrow stood at the center of Eidolon's bridge, eyes locked on the thing beyond the viewport. The darkness was wrong, alive, shifting like liquid shadow, rippling with intent. It did not glow, yet it pulsed. It did not move, yet it changed. Her gut twisted. She had seen battlefields, annihilated colonies, the cold indifference of war. But this was different. The holographic display stuttered, failing to quantify the anomaly. It had no mass, no heat signature, no detectable radiation. The sensors flickered with half-formed data, as if reality itself resisted understanding it. Commander Hale's voice was tight.
That wasn't there 5 minutes ago.
Morrow barely nodded.
No, it wasn't.
General Soren stood beside them, his face drawn and pale. He had survived this before, or at least something close to it. But now, looking at him, she wasn't sure if anyone could truly survive an encounter with the unknown.
We shouldn't be here, he murmured.
Hale scoffed, but the bravado didn't reach his eyes.
A little late for that.
The ship's proximity sensors flared red.
Contact.
The void reacted. It rippled, a disturbance spreading outward, slow at first, then impossibly fast. The anomaly stretched across the distance between them in an instant. It did not travel. It arrived. The Eidolon's lights flickered. Screens distorted into static before resetting. The temperature dropped. Morrow exhaled, watching the condensation of her own breath vanish too quickly. The ship's gravity fluctuated by a fraction of a percent, enough for the crew to feel it in their bones. Hale's hand hovered over the weapons control.
Admiral! No, Morrow's voice was sharp. Don't provoke it.
She wasn't sure why she knew that, but firing felt like the worst thing they could do, like knocking on a door that should have stayed closed. The anomaly pulsed again. A new energy spread across the hull, not an attack, but a recognition. Then came the sound. Not noise, not static. Something deeper, vibrating through the structure of the ship, through bone, through thought. A whisper that was not a whisper. Soren inhaled sharply, his fists clenched.
It knows we're here.
Morrow turned toward him. What exactly are we dealing with? Soren hesitated, his gaze locked on the void. When I disappeared 2 years ago, he said, voice strained, it wasn't because of a failed mission.
The Council didn't kill my team. They tried to warn us.
Morrow frowned.
Warn you about what?
Soren's voice dropped lower.
That this thing isn't a weapon, or a species, or an enemy. His jaw tightened. It's a survivor. Hale stiffened. A survivor of what?
Soren turned, meeting his eyes. The last time the universe reset.
Silence.
The weight of those words settled deep, heavy and unmoving.
Morrow forced herself to breathe evenly. Explain.
Soren's throat bobbed as he swallowed.
The Council always knew.
Long before they ruled, before they built their empire, they found remnants. Places where physics failed, where time bent in ways it shouldn't.
Artifacts from before.
Morrow felt the edges of something vast slipping into place. Their real purpose, Soren continued, wasn't conquest. It was containment. Every war they fought, every law they enforced, it wasn't about power.
His expression darkened.
It was about making sure no one tampered with the prison.
And we did, Hale muttered.
Morrow exhaled, steady but deliberate.
When we fired the planet killer.
Soren nodded.
The destruction of those ships, erasing them completely, it must have torn into whatever barrier they built.
His voice dropped to a whisper.
And now it is awake.
A stillness settled over the bridge, pressing against them like deep water. Morrow turned back to the void, the thing that pulsed, not with malice, but awareness.
This was no enemy, no conqueror. This was something older than war. Admiral.
The comms officer's voice was unervingly steady.
We're receiving a transmission. Morrow kept her pulse even. From the Council?
The officer swallowed.
No, ma'am. From the void.
The bridge froze.
Hale muttered. That's not possible.
Soren exhaled slowly.
Doesn't matter if it's possible. It's happening.
The transmission pulsed across the screen. No visuals, no structured language.
Only a wave of something between sound and thought.
Then, a voice. Or the memory of one.
It spoke not in words, but in understanding. Yet, when the meaning reached them, it was unmistakable. You were not meant to see.
Morrow felt the cold reach her bones. The ship systems flickered again, not failing, but reacting, as if something unseen was touching them. She straightened.
We don't understand.
The presence pulsed.
A feeling, not rage.
Regret.
Then you will learn.
The Eidolon shuddered. Alarms blared. Sensors erupted with warnings, not of an attack, but of something shifting, pulling, altering. Morrow turned to the viewport, and saw the light. Not a flash.
Not an explosion.
Something breaking. Space itself fractured, splitting apart like shattered glass, revealing something beyond it. Something watching back. The crew cried out, voices overlapping in confusion and fear. Hale stumbled, gripping the console as the ship lurched violently, caught in a force that had no source. Soren's voice cut through the chaos.
Admiral! And then everything changed.
The bridge vanished.
No ship.
No crew. No walls of steel and reinforced glass.
Morrow stood somewhere else.
A landscape stretched endlessly, a place that should not exist. Skies that burned in colors that had no name.
Ruins that twisted in and out of reality, as if time could not decide whether they were ancient or still being built. And then, the figures.
They stood at the edges of her vision, watching.
Not human. Not council. Something else. Something that had been waiting. Waiting for the prison to break.
A voice, not words, but meaning itself, filled the space around her. You opened the door.
Morrow could not move. Could not speak. Could only listen. And now we remember.
Elise Morrow stood at the threshold of a place that should not exist. She had spent her life commanding fleets, orchestrating wars, making the impossible decisions that separated victory from annihilation. Yet here, in this fractured space, none of that mattered. The sky above her was a shifting veil of color, not bound by atmosphere or light but something deeper, something alive. Beneath her feet, the ground was neither solid nor air, but a paradox of existence, a landscape trapped between creation and decay.
And the figures watched.
They were not shadows, nor were they forms. They stood at the edge of perception, flickering between possibilities, tall and angular one moment, shifting into something almost human the next. They had no faces, yet she felt their gaze press against her mind.
They had been waiting. You opened the door.
The voice was not sound. It arrived, as if it had always been there, whispering just beneath the fabric of reality.
It spoke not in words, but in meaning. Morrow forced herself to remain still. Fear would not serve her here. What are you? A pause. The presence pulsed. We are what remains.
Soren's voice reached her from somewhere behind, unsteady.
Remains of what? Of before. A chill ran through her. She had suspected. The council had always hinted at something older, something they had been desperate to contain, but hearing it spoken confirmed the nightmare.
Morrow exhaled.
You're survivors.
The figures pulsed again, something between acknowledgement and memory.
We endured the last ending.
Hale's voice, sharp with skepticism, cut in.
The last ending of what?
A silence stretched, long and unbearable.
Then, the answer came like a weight pressing down on the soul of the universe. Everything.
Morrow had faced death before.
She had fought impossible odds. But this was different.
This was not an enemy that could be outmaneuvered, not a battle that could be won with strategy.
Soren took a step forward, his expression dark with understanding. The universe ended. And you, what? Slipped through.
The figures shimmered, pulsed, shifted.
We did not slip. We were forgotten.
A memory surfaced, Soren's earlier words, the pieces clicking into place.
The council didn't rule. They contained. They had never been the greatest force in the galaxy. They had been custodians of something much older, much more fragile. Hale clenched his fists. And now we've let you out. You shattered the wall. The planet killer.
The moment we erased those ships, tore a hole through space itself, We hadn't destroyed an enemy. We had broken a seal. Morrow forced herself to think, to push back the raw terror creeping at the edges of her mind. What do you want? The air tightened, as if the question itself carried weight. To exist. A pause. To return. The words settled like a heavy stone. Morrow's breath was steady, but her mind raced. Return to what? Another silence, stretching too long. To what was taken. She understood now. They wanted the universe back. Hale took a slow step forward. That's not possible. This reality isn't yours. The figures shifted, their forms distorting in ways that made her head throb. It was before it was yours. Soren exhaled, low and sharp. They're not just survivors. His voice carried a horrible certainty. They were the first civilization, the first existence, a species or a force or something beyond definition, from the time before time. They had ruled before our universe was born, and now they wanted it back. Morrow's stomach twisted. You can't take it. The figures pulsed again. We can. A fracture spread through the sky, a wound in reality, a rip between what was and what could be. Through it, she saw something impossible. Not darkness, not light, but the shape of something pressing against the seams of existence itself. A hand. A limb. Something reaching. The bridge of Eidolon flickered in her vision. Her crew. Her people. The life they had fought to keep. This wasn't just about Earth. It was everything. A choice. Morrow set her jaw. No. The figures did not move. You refuse. Her fingers curled into fists. We won't let you take it. The presence shifted, pressing down on her mind. You misunderstand. The sky fractured further, and the space between realities shuddered. The choice was never yours. Morrow's heart slammed against her ribs. The ground trembled. The wound in the sky widened. The figures began to step forward. And then, something else intervened. A force ripped through the fabric of the void. A crack of pure light, different from the unnatural radiance of the figures. Familiar. Grounded. The figures stopped. The world lurched. And Morrow opened her eyes. She was back. The bridge of Eidolon reformed around her in fragments of reality snapping into place. The alarms were screaming. The ship was shaking, warning lights flaring across the consoles. Hale stumbled forward, gasping. What the? Soren clutched his head, eyes wild. We weren't supposed to make it back. Morrow turned to the viewport. The void was gone. Or rather, sealed. A barrier had formed where the tier had been, different from the Council's prison. This was new. Morrow's throat was dry. Who did that? A chime. The comms officer's voice wavered. Incoming transmission. Morrow's stomach dropped. From the Council? A pause. No, Admiral. From someone else. Morrow stepped forward. The screen flickered, static warping before resolving. Not a Council emissary. Not the void. Something new. A face. Human. But not quite. And when it spoke, its voice carried the weight of 100 forgotten civilizations. We've been watching. Morrow exhaled. Who are you? The figure tilted its head. The ones who stopped them last time. Silence. And then, we need to talk.